Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Well, Phil, before we get started on this week's podcast, I've got two questions for you. So,
Oh dear.
are you sitting comfortably?
Oh dear. I'm just thinking back to the John O'Hanlon.
Yeah. Here we go. Name a Korean brand, but not Kia.
Hyundai.
The second question, name a Czech Republic-based brand that's owned by the Volkswagen Group.
Skoda.
Well, yes and no.
Is that incorrectly pronounced as well?
Yeah, because I've noticed, and I'm sure listeners have as well, on some recent ad campaigns on television, that Hyundai has now become Hyundai.
Hyundai, yes.
Hyundai, yes.
Yeah.
And Skoda is Skoda.
Yep. You
Yeah.
need that twang.
Well, you do. You
doesn't
do.
work with my accent, Curtis. I'll be honest.
But it is really odd hearing them. I mean, I remember being in Korea with the Kia group, and we spent a lot of time with Hyundai, and in Korea they are very much Hyundai, and we kind of sort of giggled every time Hyundai was said, and after a couple of days it became totally normal, and hearing it now on television, it just sounds really, really odd because we all say Hyundai.
I mean, we've got to. I mean, we on some of the stories this week, but actually in general, with all the new entrants that are coming into Europe and the UK, the amount now is we ask ourselves, what's the best way to pronounce that?
Yeah.
How do because they're new, they're fresh, they're different, and they're not necessarily in our dialect, are they, necessarily in terms of our pronunciation? So we're going to get. I think we're going to get tongue tied. I can imagine us getting tongue tied now for the next year or so, Curtis, as we sort of get ahead around some of these new Chinese entrants in the main that are coming into the UK market.
Definitely, and that's without me actually bringing up either Porsche or Dacia or Dacia.
Yes,
just to add to that list.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we've got some shout outs this week, haven't we? We've had it's been we thought with the headlines might be a little bit quieter this week, but actually we've been hit with a lot of headlines. But yeah, we've got a few shout outs. So the first one is not to forget your AM Awards entries in. The closing date is vastly quickly approaching with the 24th of February. So do make sure that you get your there in time for the events in, I think it's May the 11th, is it, Curtis?
It is, yes.
AM Awards are on. So you've got to the 24th of February to get your nominations and entries in to AM.
And also a shout out for some of the recent interviews that we've run during the weeks. The most recent one was John O'Hanlon, which we've had really, really good feedback on that. So many thanks to John for joining us. And of course, Robert Forrester, who was a couple of weeks before that. Both those shows are still available on your podcast feed. So if you haven't had a chance to listen, then do find them and tune in and let us know what you think.
Yeah, and also, as always, just a reminder that before the end of the month, we will be catching up with CAP HPI again and getting an update, hopefully, off Darren or Jeremy, could be either, talking through the February trends and what's been happening in the marketplace. And, we'll talk about a little bit of that later on in today's show as well.
Yeah, and before we get into the headlines, as you mentioned, there's so many stories this week. So there's two stories that we'll mention in passing because they did attract some national coverage. And the first one is about Ford. So some sad news there because Ford announced that it'll be cutting, what will amount to 1 in 5 jobs in the UK. So it did announce plans to cut 1,300 jobs in the UK over the next 2 years, which equates to a fifth of its total workforce. And most of these job losses are going to be in R&D. And this is very much down to the transition to EV and the sort of staff and job requirements that Ford needs in Europe, because it's not just UK, it's Germany's affected as well.
And the other one is the sale or the acquisition of British Volt by an Australian firm called Recharge. But that is a positive move, particularly for the EV sector in the UK, around that production facility up there with British Volt. So hopefully, the direction of that sort of growth in battery electric support infrastructure around the manufacturing of batteries will continue, and in the UK, which is great news for the UK manufacturing sector.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
So headlines this week are from AM Online, Car Dealer, Motor Trader, Motor Trade News and Autocar, and they are: used car values reach a record high on motors.co.uk, reports eBay Motors Group. Used car forecast points to a bumpy road to recovery, says Cox Automotive. The SMMT blames the supply squeeze for 2022's used car sales drop. The positive attitude of salespeople can improve stock turn, and Judge Service has the figures to prove it. We've got 2 acquisitions this week. PeterVardy is in talks to buy 2 sites from Cazoo, and Snows expands in the south of England. And finally this week, you've already alluded to it, Phil, but we name another new Chinese brand heading to the UK.
Yeah, so heading over to AM first off, and this is the latest performance figures and activity from eBay Motors Group on the market. So the header is: used car values reach record of 18,937 high on eBay Motors Group. Now, this is it's a great report, this, and we like to go into a little bit of detail each time it's published. But AM have covered it with quite a bit of detail this month, haven't they?
Yeah, they have indeed. And as we always say, do head over to eBay Motors Group website for the full market view report. But some interesting trends here, starting at prices, so used car prices, which of course is of great interest to all of us in the industry. So the latest set of data shows, as you mentioned, that prices have reached an all-time high on the Motors platform of £18,937. And if we actually start to look at what's driven that, the average used car prices were up 5%. Amongst franchise dealers to £24,773. Independents were actually up 3% to £14,087, and car supermarkets up by 1% to £18,640. So it's up across all of those 3 main retailing sectors. And interesting to note that a lot of the price movement was actually driven around that 15,000 to 19,999 pound price band.
Yeah, and they also go into the detail, obviously, around the stock levels, and stock levels dropped from 7% from 59 units down to 55 units month on month on average, with independents saying that they felt the brunt of the reduction, down 11% from an average of 37 units down to 33 units, whilst car supermarkets declined by only 3%, from an average of 412 units down to 398 units. And interestingly, the franchise dealers remained unchanged at 85 units. So a little bit of a shift there now around that supply and stock level.
Yeah, and the third main criteria that eBay Motors Group looks at is days to sell. They lengthened by 3 days over the course of the month to 42 days, with franchise dealers holding on to cars 4 days longer at 34 days, car supermarkets 6 days longer at 37 days, and independent 7 days longer at 54 days. So that's independence 7 days longer at 54 days. So that's all month on month, December going into January.
And as Curtis mentioned earlier, I mean, it's a very detailed report. So as Curtis said, always head over to the eBay Motors Group website there, and you'll find the market view. Because when it starts going into demand, but actually by manufacturer, by model of vehicle, and down to fuel type and sectors, it shows you where that strength and weakness has been in terms of that consumer demand for each of those vehicles, and the topic that we're always talking about at the minute around battery electric vehicles and hybrid goes into a little bit more detail around, that supply level and demand and activity by make, model, etc. within the sort of electric and hybrid sector. So we'd always urge you to go and have a look at the full report in more detail.
Yeah, and we'll put a link for that on the newsletter that goes out Monday morning. So next headline is from Motor Trade News, and it is used car forecast points to a bumpy road to recovery. So this is research done by you and the guys at Cox Automotive, Phil, and it's an interesting one, this, because it's really looking at state of play in the used car market at the moment and where you expect it to go over the next 11 months in terms of pricing and that sort of consumer confidence as well.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of go into the detail. Obviously, the main criteria is obviously the forecast. So we have forecast the full year for used cars. So our baseline forecast is expecting to achieve just over that 7 million. That would be an increase of 3.2%, but that remains still 3.8% behind the average between 2001 and 2019. So we're bit of positivity depending on how the market does head, and if we start to see supply of new vehicles earlier in the year and we get that demand back as the sort of the economy and inflation gets under control, we could head more towards that 7.5 million. We are also unfortunately reporting a downside of 6.8 million, which will be down to the fact that, we still continue to have this significant shortage of stock coming into the marketplace. EVs take a little bit of challenge for adoption in the used car marketplace, and still that economy still remains sort of challenging as well. But there's a lot going on in the marketplace, and we've talked about it before, Curtis, haven't we? 46 million vehicles lost from production. It's not recovering quickly. There's still quite a bit to do around that used adoption of electric vehicles and initiatives and appetite in that used vehicle space, and as we've been seeing on values of those sort of declining over recent months, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the supply challenges that we saw pretty much through all of last year. Are there any signs of that easing at all in the auction halls?
There is, yeah. I mean, there's little bits. There's a little bit of activity through wholesale. It is increasing. We are reporting week on week at the minute that we've seen a slight increase in supply. Demand is still there, though. First-time conversions are still there. Overall conversions are still very positive as well. So the retail market is now starting to pick up. It kind of took a little bit longer in January than we may have expected, but it did catch up. And there's still strong demand. And as we've said before, there's still a significant shortage, particularly in that 0 to 3 year old market for petrol and diesel vehicles because of the shortage of supply and the transition to battery electric vehicles. So the demand is there whilst the supplies remain short.
Yeah, so that's very much the thoughts on this year. The next story from AM Online looks at the picture from last year because the SMMT has collated and published the used car sales figures. So the headline there is supply squeeze blamed for 8.5% used car sales decline in 2022. So the figures are 6.89 million used car transactions were completed over the course of last year. And as I say, that was down 8.5%, which equates to just over 640,000 units down on that 2021 figure. But if you start comparing that with the pre-pandemic levels. It's 13% down on 2019's performance.
Yeah, and it is coming. It is slow, but it's this. We've gone through last year in terms of this move because people couldn't get new cars, or the lead times were too long for new cars, and therefore people were moving into that used vehicle marketplace. And much depends this year of whether we start to get that new vehicle production back, which is expected to probably accelerate more in the second half of the year than in the first half of the year. And will that start to take product away from, or buyers away from, the used market into the new car market as people start to recover activity there? But there's also a good story in Car Dealer. We won't go into it in much detail, but Car Dealer have done a bit of an investigation into what's next for used car prices, and a couple of friends of the show, including Umish, who's chair of the IMDA and owner of Specialist Cars, and Darren Martin are both quoted in there in terms of talking around where they're expecting that used vehicle values to head over the remainder of 2023, which is quite a good little report there, isn't it?
It is, yeah, definitely worth checking out. And just to close on that SMMT story, I was interested to see some of the stats around fuel choice, which is obviously a topic we look at very closely these days, because petrol and diesel were down over the course of the year in terms of used car sales, but EVs were up 37.5%, taking 71,000 units. And hybrids were up as well at 8.6%, and plug-in hybrids were up at 3.6%. And there was I don't know if you caught it at all on social media, but there was quite a bit of kickback to a story that Daily Mail ran about how little EVs had increased over the course of last year in terms of used sales, but they were actually up 37.5%, albeit from a low base. But I mean, that's a sizable jump.
I mean, it's in the right direction, isn't
Yeah.
it? That's the thing. I mean, we know that the volume of battery electric vehicles is going to start significantly increasing, particularly after the output that we've seen over the last 3 years, where this transition to EV, and the fact that there was certain manufacturers that could only get battery electric vehicles into the marketplace, and that's what went on to vehicle fleets. Those are now starting to come back into the wholesale and used vehicle park. So it's going to get very interesting in terms of how quickly those volumes return to the used market, and how quickly we can get that used demand up for used electric vehicles.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed.
So next headline is from Motor Trader, and this will cheer up a lot of listeners to the podcast, I'm sure. So the headline is "Positive Attitudes of Salespeople Improve Stock Turn," says Judge Service. Now, I guess if we just look at the headline in isolation, that does kind of reinforce what I think most of us in the industry would kind of expect. But what's particularly interesting about this is that Judge Service's research actually puts a figure on it. And they've researched for their forthcoming industry paper over 53,000 customers, and this was over the course of beginning of July and end of December. So they were actively asking customers this particular question, how do they respond to a good salesperson? And it is very, very positive. So what this shows is that a 3.5 day saving on stock turn can actually be achieved if salespeople are delivering the highest possible customer satisfaction. So it is actually quantifiable, and they've researched this from that customer base.
Yeah, and it's interesting here that because it says here that other key influences included staff taking the trouble to explain paperwork and their attitude at handover. And we kind of, I mean, obviously, this is kind of some of my background around this salespeople. You kind of get that, don't you? That you can understand there is probably a definite correlation between the two. Nobody wants to meet a miserable salesperson. You want people to go through the paperwork. You want the handover to be positive and gone through correctly, etc., etc. But like you said, it is quantifiable that out of 53,000 buyers, that they've actually got some stats that demonstrate that positive attitude, the fact of going through paperwork and doing the right attitude at handover actually does increase sales as well,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it gives you that positive result from a consumer perspective.
And it's those incremental improvements, because the research shows that how a 5% improvement in a customer score can actually result in a 20.5% jump in the dealer's promoter score. So
Mm.
it really is about those incremental gains.
No, it's good. It's good that, and I can't wait for the whole report and for Neil to come on and talk us through the report when the timing is right. So great there. And going back over to car dealer, and we talked about acquisition and things like this, and Cazoo hitting the headlines, but and you can tell your little story and what you noticed in a second, Curtis. But the header is that PeterVardy in advanced talks to buy 2 sites from used car retailer dealer Cazoo. So they're saying that they're in significantly advanced conversations with Cazoo, that the franchise car dealer wants to acquire Grangemouth, which is a customer centre and a prep centre, and that the used car seller Cazoo is in talks with 3,000 staff across the UK about job losses as well. So, kind of quite a bit happening now, isn't there, with Cazoo and this sort of selling of sites and redundancies, etc. But it's great that you've got someone like PeterVardy stepping in there to try and take that over.
Yeah, and the story, I mean, hats off to Car Dealer for running this story. And there is confirmation from a PeterVardy spokesperson who says PeterVardy are in discussions with Cazoo regarding a potential sale of the Grangemouth and Livingston sites, and are working through the details, including the scope of potential 2P transfer of staff. So, there is confirmation there that it is happening. And that is really welcome news for those sites and indeed the staff. And the spin-off story that you alluded to, I've been watching the Six Nations at the weekend, and when Scotland were playing Wales, if you you didn't even have to look closely, but the shirts were sponsored by PeterVardy for Scotland and Cazoo for Wales. So every time you saw competing players in the same shot, it was PeterVardy versus Cazoo.
Job there, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting how there's a coming together here.
Coming together,
Yeah.
definitely. So again, I mean, we'll share, we'll cover that story even when the sale does go through. But you can see that potentially we'll see other things happening with the Cazoo sale of some of their operations that they're looking to get rid of at the minute. And sticking with car dealer, a little bit of an acquisition and a growth with Snows. They've expanded their network with the acquisition of J Davy, Vauxhall, and Citroen sites in Basingstoke. And I think this is more about the fact that Snows are back into the Citroen brand, isn't it, Curtis?
It is, yeah. I mean, Snow's very well established dealer group operating, what is 52 sites across the south of England. They're based in Southampton. And yeah, as you say, this means that they'll be representing Citroen again. They've got a Citroen authorised repairer business, but this will see them selling cars again, which is good news for the group, and increasing their representation with Vauxhall. So a really, really good solid move here, which makes absolute sense, and some really good synergies here with the business as it continues to grow.
Yeah, and the chief operating officer of Snows Motor Group, Neil McHugh, has said that he's extremely delighted with the acquisition, that the dealerships sit in an existing territory of theirs and represent 2 brands in Basingstoke already. So we're confident it will all work really well. So well done to those guys. Now, alluded to at the start of the show, and we're covering a story on Autocar. This was picked up by other trade platforms this week as well, but this is kind of they're all big operators in China, aren't they, Curtis? And we're not sure who is the biggest, and because they all say they are the biggest.
They all claim it, don't they?
They all claim that, but we have got another new Chinese entrant to the UK and I suspect European market from China, and we think it's Chery. It's not the best for me to pronounce with my R's, Curtis, but
I'm going with Chery, but you stay with Chery if you like.
Probably both.
Yeah.
With what we were talking about earlier, but we'll see what does happen. But this is expected that they're talking that they'll launch the new Amoda 5 crossover in the UK in early 2024 as the first of several models from this new fashion-focused and EV-based brand at the forefront of the company's global expansion. Now, interestingly, they've got a bit of a shared relationship with JLR, haven't they?
They have indeed, yeah. So this makes the story particularly interesting because Chery is cherry. You say tomato, I say tomato. So Chery is a big exporter. It's last year it sold 450,000 vehicles across Asia, Australia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. So big player, but it's perhaps best known in the UK as Jaguar Land Rover's joint venture partner in China, and it currently handles production of the Range Rover Evoque, Land Rover Discovery Sport, Jaguar XF and Jaguar XE for the local market in China. So, this, of course, isn't unusual. A lot of Western car brands do partner and have joint ventures with Chinese brands for the Chinese and Asian markets. So, they will be coming to Europe with some scale behind them.
Yeah, we'll keep a definite eye out on this one because they say it's interesting really when you start to look at some of the images. I thought they'd have a closer sort of resemblance of JLR product, but actually when you look at the vehicle, it's probably closer to like a Mocha or a RAV4, isn't it? But it doesn't necessarily mean that is the image of the vehicle that will land on UK shores in 2024, but certainly be watching this one very closely because it'll be this and the others that we've talked about. It'll be a significant change to the UK automotive sector.
That list is getting longer, isn't it? Because we've got Great Wall Motors, we've got BYD. I was reading the other day about a new brand called Zeekr as well. Are there any others? Probably,
yeah. But that's it for this week. So they say keep your ear out for the hopefully forthcoming CAP HPI update on the used car market for the month of February. We have got other interviews lined up for the midweek interviews. So again, keep an eye out for that. And as Curtis said at the start of the show, the Motor Trade Radio newsletter will be published this Monday coming with all the links, but particularly we'll add the link to the eBay Motors market view on there, so you can look at some of the stats and data that we were talking about earlier in a little bit more detail.
That's all for now. Many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio Podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.